Hello, once again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our virtual classroom. Today, we will be going over lesson 20-2. Again, that is lesson 20-2, which is percents, fractions, and decimals. As usual, feel free to pause the video wherever you need to. If I'm going too fast or if you need to review something, please feel free to pause the video and then you can continue, rewatch it, etc. I'm sorry about that. Okay. Percents, fractions, and decimals. First things first, why are we doing three things at once? Why are we doing percents, fractions, and decimals together? Well, it is because percents, fractions, and decimals are three different ways of saying the same thing. Again, something that can be expressed as a percent can be expressed as a fraction, and that fraction can be expressed as a decimal, and that decimal can be expressed as a percent, etc. They are three different ways of saying the exact same thing. Beginning here with percents, which we haven't covered yet this school year. Regardless, I know that you guys use percents all the time. The device that you're probably watching this video in, if it's a laptop or a phone, has a battery, right? And we read that in percent, right? If it's 100% charged, then you have full battery. If it's 50% charged, you have half battery, 1%. You better plug it in soon, or it's going to die, correct? Your grade is an excellent example of a percent. If you get a 70%, that means passing, but still it's better to get 100%, right? When you get 100, that is 100%, meaning you got all of them right. At the store, it's not uncommon to have something that is like 10%, 20%, 30% off the price. All those are examples of percents. But what is a percent is the question. What is a percent? Well, a percent, ladies and gentlemen, literally means per cent. Per cent. And cent is a term that we use for money. In fact, a cent in our currency is 1 out of 100. You need 100 cents to make one whole dollar. The word cent actually means 100. So per cent means out of 100. Again, the word percent literally means per 100 or out of 100. So when you see something like 40%, and that is the percent symbol, notice that that almost kind of looks like 100 or like a division or fraction. 40% literally means the fraction 40 out of 100. When you see 40%, that is another way of writing 40 out of 100. In the same way, if you ever see a number like 40 over 100, that literally means 40%. If you have 2 out of 100, 2 per 100, 2%, that would be 2%. That's it. That's what a percent is. It is out of 100. Now you might say, well, Mr. Lugo, that's fine, but how often do you have a fraction that is perfectly over 100? Well, it doesn't have to be. If you have something like 1 out of 2, 1/2, we know, ladies and gentlemen, that we can make this into something over 100. Let's change this into a percent. Well, 2 times what gives me 100? Well, 2 times 50 is 100. Therefore, I have to multiply the numerator by 50 as well. 1 times 50 is 50. So that means that 1 out of 2 is the same thing as 50 out of 100, which is 50%. 50 per 100. You can do that for any fraction, ladies and gentlemen. It's not always as easy as this one, but you can change any fraction into a fraction over 100. In other words, you can change any fraction into a percent. Another example, we have 8%. That simply means 8 over 100. 22% simply means 22 out of 100. Pretty simple. That is what a percent is. It is simply a number over 100. So if you will copy down this table, or at least listen carefully, we have percent, fraction, and decimal. We can change from a percent to a fraction, and then from a fraction to a decimal. Here we have the same exact examples. We have 40%. As we just saw, 40% literally means 40 out of 100. Because again, a percent is a fraction out of 100. Now, that is technically 40% as a fraction, except that this is not simplified. It is not simplified. And so I can simplify this. I can divide both of them by 4. No, I can divide both of them by 20. But if I go slowly, if I divide them both by 2, that would give you 20 over 50 divided by 2 again. That would be 10 out of 25, and then you divide that by 5. Ladies and gentlemen, the simplest form of 40 out of 100 is 2/5. Now, though they look very differently, yes, 40% and 2/5 mean the exact same thing. We just saw that 40% is the same thing as 40 over 100. We just simplified that to 2/5, but yes, 2/5 and 40% mean the exact same thing. Now, to go from a fraction to a decimal, we need to remind ourselves that a fraction simply means division. That means 2 divided by 5. So let's work that out. 2 divided by 5. I'm going to do that here on the side. 2 divided by 5. But Mr. Lugo, you put the smaller number inside. Yes, I did. Because remember, the first number goes inside. The first number is the dividend. All right. If this was 5 over 2, then the 5 would go inside, but that is not the case here, ladies and gentlemen. We have 2 divided by 5. So can we divide 2 into 5? Can we divide 2 into 5 pieces? Yes. 5, and it's going to be less than 1 because 2/5 is a proper fraction. So 5 cannot fit into 2, but 5 can fit into 20. 5 times 4 is 20, so my answer would be 0.4. 0.4. So 2/5 as a decimal is 0.4. Why did I write 0.40? Because it's the exact same thing. And 0.40 is read as 40 hundredths. If this was a 4, that's 4. If this was just 0.4, that's 4/10. 0.40 is 40 hundredths. And 40 hundredths reminds me of this. Isn't this 40 hundredths? Ladies and gentlemen, it's like we went full circle. 40 hundredths is the same thing as 40 over 100, which is 40 per 100 or 40%. We'll cover this in more detail in a little bit. Let's try another one. 8% we saw as 8 over 100. We simplify that, that gives me 2 out of 25. Now, even if I hadn't, well, 2 out of 25. Now, how do we change a fraction to a decimal? Well, we divide 2, divided into 25 pieces. 25 goes into 2 0 times. It doesn't fit into 20 either, but it does fit into 200 exactly 8 times. Hence, we get 8 hundredths. It's in the 100 place, 8 hundredths, 8 out of 100, right? And 8 out of 100 is 8%. Now, what if you hadn't simplified all the way? What happens if you divide 8 by 100? Would that still give me the same answer? Yes, it will, because it is the exact same thing. In fact, 8 divided into 100 pieces. 100 cannot fit into 8. 100 cannot fit into 80, but it fits into 800 exactly 8 times. So as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, I get the exact same answer. It's just that this is not simplified. One last one, we have 22%, 22 over 100. We can divide both of these by 2. So 22 divided by 2 is 11. 100 divided by 2 is 50. That's 11/50. Now, how do I go from a fraction to a decimal? We just divide 11 divided by 50. 50 cannot go into 1 or 2 into 11, but it does go into 110 twice. 50 times 2 is 100. 110 minus 100 is 10. Let's keep going, bring down the 0. 50 goes into 100 twice. Therefore, my answer will be 22 hundredths. 22 hundredths. Before I go on, if you do not remember or do not know how to divide a smaller number by a larger number, or how to continue to give me a decimal answer, I do encourage you to go to Schoology. And once you are there, if you go to Schoology, go to my course, obviously my main course, and scroll down to the very bottom to where it says resources. Scroll down to where it says resources, and you will find a whole bunch of videos. But notice how we have a division review and a dividing without remainders. That dividing without remainders shows us how to divide when we're going to get a decimal answer. So I highly encourage you to watch that video if you're lost in that regard. All right, let us continue. So ladies and gentlemen, now that we have our percent, fraction, and decimal equivalents, and this was 22 hundredths. Now, notice how the fractions don't really look anything like the percent or the decimal. But when we look at the percent and the decimal, look at the similarities. In fact, 40% was the same thing as 40 hundredths. 8% was the same thing as 8 hundredths, and 22% was the same thing as 22 hundredths. So there's a pattern there, and let's use that pattern, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll see that pattern down here. In fact, let me zoom in just so that that's all that we can see. I want you guys to focus on this. So notice that, again, we just saw that 40% is equal to 40 hundredths. Now, what did we have to do? Let's make a shortcut here, ladies and gentlemen. What do we have to do to get from 40% to 40 hundredths? Well, before we even do that, I want to remind you that when you have a whole number, like let's just say I had just 40, not 40%, just 40, does that have a decimal? Well, it does. The decimal is always after the ones place, so there would be a decimal right there. This is the same thing, 40 is the same thing as 40.0. It is an integer, meaning it doesn't have a decimal value, but it still does have a decimal. There's always a decimal. There's always a decimal after the ones place. Well, it's the same thing with percents. There is technically a decimal after what would be the ones place. So 40% is the same thing as 40.0%. 40.0%. So if you notice, the only difference between 40% and 40 hundredths is the location of the decimal. In fact, it's almost like if I took the decimal and moved it twice to the left, and now the decimal is in front of the 4. You see how the decimal is now in front of the 4? And so, ladies and gentlemen, that is the exact same pattern. You just take your percentage and you move the decimal in that percentage 2 times to the left, and now you have the decimal equivalent. Or you can remember my favorite drink in math class, which my favorite drink in math class happens to be Dr. Pepper. Why Dr. Pepper? Well, the D, we can think of that as decimal and the P as percent. So let's start with a percent, that percent being 40%. And to change a percent to be just a decimal, we need to take the decimal in the percent and move it from the P to the D. So we're going to move it to the left, from the P to the D to the left. So we're going to move it to the left, and we always move it 2 times. When we're using this method, when we're working with percents to decimals, we always move it 2 times. It doesn't matter where it is, where the decimal is, you always move it only 2 times. So again, 40%, we go from P to D, we go to the left, 2 times. So now the decimal's in front of the 4. Ladies and gentlemen, now we're back to 40 hundredths. Well, what if we started with 40 hundredths? What if we started with a decimal? Well, same thing, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Pepper. This time, however, we are going from a decimal to the percent. So I'm going to go from D to P. So I'm going to go to the right 2 times. So 1, 2. Now it's behind the 0. So 40 hundredths would be the same thing as 40%. It's that easy. Let me do that one last time. So we have 40%. Here I'm going to do Dr. Pepper. I am beginning with a percent, and I'm going to make it into a decimal. So I'm going to get that decimal and move it 2 times from the P to the D, so to the left, and now it becomes 40 hundredths. Now, if I start with 40 hundredths and I do Dr. Pepper, so now I'm beginning with a decimal to the percent, so I'm going to go to the right. How many times? It's always 2 times, 1, 2. Now it's behind the 0. It is now 40%. Notice how this works for the decimal for 8% as well. So if I start with 8%, which is exactly what we have down here, we started with 8%. And actually, I can minimize all this just so that there's less distractions. So if we were to do something like 8%, and we wanted to change this percent into a decimal, then I have to go from the P to the D. So we're going to go to the left. Notice that there's technically a decimal right here. And how many times do I have to move it? 1, 2. I just need to fill in the zeros wherever they're at. So, and then get rid of the percent symbol. So now 8% is the same thing as 8 hundredths. Now, if I started with 8 hundredths, and again, I want to change this decimal now to a percent, and I go to the right. I'm going to move the decimal 2 times to the right. So let's go ahead and do that. Take the decimal, move 1, 2 to the right. Now it's behind the 8, so it'd be 8%. Pretty simple, right? Well, let's try one more. Let us try one more. What if we started with, let's start with 11, no, 22%, 22%. As you can see, I'm going to go, Dr. Pepper, always write DP. And this time I'm starting with a percent. I'm starting with a percent. So I'm going to make it into decimal, so go to the left. So we're going to take that decimal one, 2 times to the left. Now it's in front of that first 2, so it becomes 22 hundredths. 22 hundredths. Now, if I start with 22 hundredths, we're going to do Dr. Pepper. So this time we are moving from the decimal to the percent. So I'm going to go to the right. We always move it 2 times. So I'm going to take that decimal, go 1, 2. Now it's behind that second 2, so it becomes 22%. Pretty simple. Pretty simple. You can do that for any percentage. Or so if I have 5%, Dr. Pepper, we go percent to decimal, we go to the left. 1, 2, 5% is the same thing as 0.05 or 0.5. You start with a decimal, 0.71. So Dr. Pepper, decimal to percent, we move to the right 2 times 1, 2.71 or 71 hundredths is the same thing as 71%. It works for anything, ladies and gentlemen. It's always 2 times. All right, with that in mind, and notice how that's exactly what I did down here. Let's go to this second page. So we saw how to go from a percent, we started with, percent to fraction, and then from a fraction to a decimal. And then we even saw how to go from a percent directly to a decimal, and from a decimal back to a percent. But now, and we saw how to go from a fraction to a decimal. But now, ladies and gentlemen, can we go from a decimal? Can we go from a decimal back to a fraction? Well, of course we can. Let's start off with a fraction, 2/5. Now, by now, you should know that when you see a fraction, that simply means to divide. When in doubt, ladies and gentlemen, if you have a fraction, just divide the numerator by the denominator. Having divided those two, we see that 2/5 gives me 0.4 or 0.40. How did I get that? Well, I simply got the 2. I divided it into 5 parts. 5 cannot go into 2, but it goes into 24 times. That is how I got that answer over there. Okay, so how do I go from a decimal back to a fraction? Well, simply ask yourselves, how do you actually say this number? And let's work with 40 hundredths. So 0.40, ones, tens, hundreds, that's 40 hundredths. So we're literally going to say 40 hundredths. Wait, 40 hundredths, 40 hundredths. Wait, isn't that the same thing as 40 over 100? 40 over 100. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a fraction. 40 hundredths is 40 out of 100. If I simplify that, it brings me back to 2/5. Divide both of these by 20, it gives you 2/5. Not only that, but 40 hundredths is literally 40 of 100. Wait, didn't we say that a percent is a fraction over 100? Ladies and gentlemen, once you have a fraction over 100, it's already a percent. Now, what if you had written 4/10 as opposed to 40 hundredths? Well, same thing. 4/10 is 4 out of 10. Simplify that, we're back to 2/5. And that's it. Interesting. Let's try another one. 2 over 25. Again, the way that we do a fraction to a decimal, we simply divide. 2 divided by 25. Believe me that 2 divided by 25 is going to give you 0.08. How do we change this decimal back to a fraction? Just say it correctly. 0.08 is actually 8 hundredths. 8 hundredths. Wait, 8 out of 100? Yes, which by the way is a percent, but 8 over 100, you simplify that and we're back to 2/25. We're right back where we started. Same thing with 11/50ths. Same thing with 11/50ths. Divide the 2, we get 22 hundredths. 22 hundredths is 22 over 100. Simplify that, we're back to 11/50ths. Because both of these are divisible by 2. Anytime you have a fraction you divide by the same number, the numerator and denominator, or you multiply by the same number, the numerator and denominator, you're going to get an equivalent fraction. So ladies and gentlemen, hopefully you found this helpful. I don't want this video to go on any longer. Yes, this is super important. We're going to be using this quite a bit in the next few weeks. And with that in mind, I will see you next time.